Welcome back for this third session from the exceptionality series. Today we're going to be talking about communication, learning disability category. Before we begin, I really want to take a moment just to compare the two profiles we've already seen with one clear LD profile. So I just want to state that oftentimes the profiles are not this clear, and really it's just for demonstration purposes. And I want to look specifically from an IQ point of view and the academics. So there's usually a lot of variability, and I kind of got rid of that today just for this. Let me share my screen, and we are recording. There we go. Okay, so this graph, just kind of as a review of last week, this graph represents a very clear DD profile, like we talked about on Friday. And again, I wanted to apologize for my video cutting out, but generally we were done, so that's fine. There was a conversation happening though, and I wanted to reassure you that providing a diagnosis when one is warranted is always the most beneficial decision and the only ethical decision that I can make. We should really not contemplate hiding that from the family, but rather if there's a struggle with dealing with it, we should really double down on our efforts to support them and increase what they need to be able to cope with that. So just wanted to say that. So this is kind of the DD profile, very flat and in this very low, extremely low range. And if you compare that with MID, also kind of flat, below the average range, and a little higher than DD. So that kind of accounts for the level of development that you would expect from them. Okay, so I would say that from one perspective, that was the hard stuff. And it's really from the perspective of something that's difficult to accept, because conceptually it's not hard. So today it's easier to accept the diagnosis of LD, but it's much more conceptually complicated. So I want you to look at something like this as something that might represent an LD. So I understand this is a lot of visual information, but before I simplify it and remove the DD and MID profiles, I want to draw your attention to the thinking and reasoning skills on the left-hand side of the graph, specifically in the LD profile. So you can see that the thinking and reasoning skills are solidly in the colored average range. So at least the first 4 dots, which are, for all intents and purposes, the most important areas of functioning when we look at higher order thinking and reasoning skills. So that includes like the first dot being the full scale IQ, second one being the ability to describe words and how things belong together conceptually. The next dot being the ability to solve visual puzzles and manipulate information in your mind, so rotate visually. The next one being the ability to figure out rules and relationships in order to apply that information to new situations. All of that average with this, like a nice solid average. So also something to note is that the DD and MID profiles are flat, whereas the LD profile, we can't see it all because there's so much variability. So I will clean that up for you. There you go. So there are 3 differences I want to draw your attention to. So first, I already noted that these thinking and reasoning skills are in the average range. If you can see my pointer here. The second thing I want you to notice is the dotted line. So the dotted line I'm putting there just, it's not usually in my graphs, but I'm putting it there to show you that that is where the thinking and reasoning skills are. That's approximately where I would expect the academics to be. So it's kind of a predictive line that I've put there for you. And you see that there are some points, if you look over at the academics, that are in the average range, while others are not. And third, I want you to look into the area of thinking and reasoning at these 2 processing abilities here that are way below average in the range of deficit and in the low average range. Those represent weaknesses, areas of weakness in the child. A child's ability specifically to hold information in mind and manipulate it while not forgetting it. and the ability to visually scan information quickly when there's no requirement for thinking and reasoning. So it's just paper, pencil copying. So these two together are something we call cognitive efficiency. So weakness in this area could explain why the child has average intellectual ability, is not succeeding as well as expected academically. So this could be the reason why. So those three things together form the basis of a learning disability diagnosis. Okay, so here inclusion is extremely easy and definitely achievable. But that wasn't always the case. And I wanted to present this to you because of the fact that right now, DD and MID in your school board are not necessarily inclusive. So if we look at the case of LD, in the 1960s, let's say, children with LD were absolutely excluded. And, some people disagree with that because they were in the regular classroom, but they were ignored and they were made to repeat the grade until they achieved the goals for that grade. So for example, someone with a severe LD, and this is taken from a true case, might remain in grade 2 until he learned that subject matter. And so if he never learned it, he might never leave. And so at 14, when he started shaving, deciding to leave and quit school, that is exclusion. I know that person was probably LD because they held a job, raised a family, demonstrate average intelligence on a regular basis. So that's exclusion. We're not attending to you. We're not going to help you learn. We'll make no effort to service you. Then we improved a bit. So back when I was in school in the 80s, we had more of a segregated system. We will attend to you, but you're spec ed. So my friends used to say like, oh, he's in the sped class. And that meant to us, even though we weren't mean, it meant to us that he was different and he was maybe not as smart as us. So we see you, we'll educate you, but you're not necessarily part of the group. So it really leads to that perception that you're lesser than others. And that's far from the truth. Now we have it right. People with LD are seen for who they are. They're capable of learning, but have areas of weakness that make it difficult for them to show what they're capable of doing. But they're just as smart as other people around them. They're expected and they're capable of being independent and self-sufficient and contribute meaningfully to society in a large way. So some children we have still needing resource, but for all intents and purposes, children with LD can very easily be within this group here, inclusion. So when you hear learning disability, I know sometimes it's just not clear what that is. I just really want you to think yay, because that just means so much in the long run. So what does that mean? It means they're developing normally. So aside from these little hiccup processing issues, they're typically developing. So they probably walked on time. They probably, unless their issue was verbal comprehension, they probably talked on time. Unless their issues are visual spatial in nature, where they don't pick up on social cues, usually that's not an issue. They learn to socialize. They don't need any special intervention to transfer knowledge from one setting to the next, the way you do with a child with a developmental disability. So you see evidence of them using their intellectual ability, for example, in the fact that they struggle to decode, but they can figure out what they're reading anyways. That is evidence of intellect, thinking and reasoning. So their progress in their development continues without any special teaching like that's required in DD and MID sometimes. So with the right accommodations, they can do whatever they want in life. The child will likely find what they're good at, and because they're good at it, they'll be rewarded by it, and therefore they'll seek to do more of that. So in essence, their strengths will guide their career choice, ideally. It's very likely that the child will achieve whatever they set their mind to. So if they set off wanting to be an astronaut and then eventually scientists, they don't really like them, and it's related to their LD, we're not going to say, oh, you can be an astronaut. Probably they're going to say like, I prefer architecture. And so they'll just go towards architecture. And this is true, especially if they learn to be persistent towards completing their goals and learn to cope with failure, which they will inevitably be faced with. This is yet another example of how IQ is not an indicator of success. If the child with average intelligence experiences failure and hardship and they don't learn to persist, they don't move forward, and then they're prone to these emotional, social, behavioral issues. And that's how the category of behavior really gets confounded with the category of LD. You have teachers saying, I'm not sure they want to. So that's just a little aside for you. Everybody wants to. Everybody wants to succeed. If you get the impression the child is not motivated and not interested, and you think that that's the issue, it's very unlikely that that's the issue. There's usually a processing deficit that's making it so hard for them that they're not interested in it. Okay, so again, what does it mean for them over time? In the case of LD, you share that information and knowledge with them. So if you share growth mindset with them, they should be able to apply that themselves and independently become motivated and propelled to move forward. So standardization. The tools I use are standardized and the norms. So I'm going to talk about standardization, but I changed things up a little bit. So one example of a standardized tool is a ruler, but we also have a thermometer, measuring cups, a scale. So these are all standardized measures. You can have a thermometer, for example, if we use that as the example. So let's say you have a thermometer at your house and you tell your mom who's in Florida that it's only 4 degrees here at Six Nations. And your mom in Florida will know what that means. She'll have a sense of what that means. Likewise, if she says, oh, it's 25 degrees here in Florida, that means something to you. And you're both comparing the exact same thing. So it's a way to describe a variable precisely. So rather than saying it's kind of cold or it's kind of hot, you know exactly what the temperature is. So my tools are standard in that way. I use them the same way other psychologists and psychometrists use them, and we have confidence that we're using them appropriately, and therefore that we would be measuring the same thing if we had the opportunity. So we're going to move to normed. Norm referenced measures compare a child's knowledge and skills to the knowledge and skills of the norm group. The norm group are those that completed the test before it had norms, and their results created the norms. So one measure that families are familiar with is the baby weight growth chart in the pediatrician's office, because I know we talked about from the 1st to the 100th. But to kind of put it in perspective, if your child goes to his well baby visit and weighs at the 50th percentile, you know that he's average. You know that if a child is at the 75th percentile, so closer to about here, he's still average, but he weighs more than 75% of the babies in this group, and he weighs less than 25% of the people in the group. Likewise, if he's at the 25th percentile, so around here, he weighs more than 25% of the kids and less than about 75% of the kids. Okay, so whereas the DD and the MID kids are simply down kind of at this end, the LD kids are going to be in the more average range. So recall, if we look at norming, we have the first child who's down here, and the 99th and the 100th child who's up at the high end, just past 130, where about 2% of the population are, but 68% of the population falls within this average range, which is 100 plus or minus 15. So on the graphs that I show you, you're going to see the number 85 to 115. That falls on the broadly average range. I'm going to add in a little something here. In the education system, most information is aimed at about an IQ of 90, so the 25th percentile and up. And so we do have a significant number of kids who struggle. Okay, so let's move into some LD. So when we give a diagnosis of LD, you should know that it's not a cohesive group. However, there are 3 things that are always true, and I kind of already stated it. So it's a little repetitive, but it bears repeating. The child has average abilities for thinking and reasoning. The second thing that is common to all kids with LD is that academically, they're not functioning as well as expected given their thinking and reasoning abilities. but there's variability within that. So they could be struggling across all areas or just in one or just two areas. And the third thing that's common for all kids with LD is we've identified why there's a discrepancy between their thinking and reasoning and their academics. So we do that by looking at various processing abilities. So a learning disorder is an information processing problem that prevents a person from learning a skill and using it effectively. However, there could be any number of processes that can be affected. And so the processing weakness is different in all cases. So the child could have one area of weakness, which would probably result in a milder learning disability, or they could have multiple areas of weakness. So I will go over some of the different psychological processes before we look at a profile. So as in the example that I provided earlier, cognitive efficiency can be the processing deficit that leads to a diagnosis of learning disability. Cognitive efficiency is the addition of the two areas of deficit, working memory and processing speed. But know that the child could also only have a deficit in working memory or only have a deficit in processing speed. And please feel free to kind of chime in if you have questions. There's something that is seeming not to make sense. When the child has cognitive efficiency deficits, the profile is often lower in all areas academically. The child could have phonological awareness problems. Usually that impacts reading the most, and it's actually that area that is most well known for predicting reading difficulties. They might have rapid naming issues. Rapid naming is the ability to quickly just read letters or numbers or tell me what the colors are on this page, and we compare how quickly you can generate information, verbal information from your mind compared to other kids. So there's not a lot of thinking going on. You don't have to tell me the different hues of the color or any information about what you're looking at. You just need to be able to rapidly state the information. So that's rapid naming. Results in rapid naming usually end up with someone who is very slow to complete the work, but has the intellectual ability to do the work if given extra time. Often it's also related to poor spelling because we consider that it's a difficulty in kind of remembering what that information looks like. And so spelling is often affected. It's not on this list that I'm showing you, but if you add phonological awareness together with rapid naming, we call that a double deficit. So that has a huge impact usually on reading and spelling, but also on math fluency. I hope I'm not overwhelming you. I was overwhelmed when I was writing down the number of processing issues. The picture might be best explained by auditory processing weaknesses. That's when the child seems to understand language receptively, but not when it's presented in longer sentences or if it's presented in a noisy environment. And it also overlaps with auditory working memory issues, verbal abilities, and phonological processing. So that's a cluster that happens sometimes. That usually results in overall lower academic achievement. So I wonder if you're kind of thinking about this, if the question starts to come up, right? So if you have a child you're presenting who's low across the board, how nice it is to know what their intellectual ability is, because one child is working as hard as he can and is kind of producing the most that he can. And that's important to know. And you also need to know the one who's frustrated and could do better if he was provided with particular accommodations. So that's really one of the main reasons why we're looking at trying to distinguish between the two. There are more. It could be memory related. So sometimes just the verbal memory is impacted, and that impacts reading comprehension and sometimes written expression. So it's difficult to hold verbal information in mind. Sometimes it's more of a visual memory. Now that's more of a kind of controversial deficit, but I've definitely seen it, and I feel like it impacts spelling and kind of your ability to visualize math problems, remember punctuation, because it's something that you would see and say like, oh, that's missing, it needs a period or should be a capital. So visual memory can be what's going on. Then we have children with ADHD, and sometimes they have executive functions issues that can't be corrected with medication. And so the child with ADHD's attention is better with the medication, but their executive functions are still lagging. And so that might be comorbid with the ADHD and actually be a learning disability. And the executive function is basically when you consider the boss. So the person who is telling you what to do. Okay, so executive functions, that is the ability to organize your behavior, to plan, to have self-control, self-motivation, anything that you associate with the word executive. So the boss, someone who's high functioning and able to kind of manage things. So that can be an issue. There could be spatial deficits, and that might explain math problems, but also it could explain some writing issues. And motor coordination is also an issue. So motor coordination is just your ability to copy. So if I give you a shape, can you copy it accurately? Can you integrate what you see with what your hand does? And if that's an issue, then sometimes the child has writing difficulties. And finally, if the child has weak verbal comprehension, then all of the academics are impacted, but they're frustrated because they have this good fluid reasoning and an ability to kind of notice things and do rules, and they would be really great in certain situations, but not in the area of verbal reasoning. Okay, so the good thing that I'm going to tell you is that you're not expected to memorize all of these processing deficits. When we assess a child, that this is what we're doing. We're looking for the intellectual ability to be in the average range. We're looking to see how they're doing academically and if what the teacher is saying maps on. And then we're trying to go through the kind of investigative process of figuring out why they're struggling academically. And so once we give you that recommendation, we'll tell you it is cognitive efficiency. And then you can, if you want to do more research, you can look up cognitive efficiency and how to deal with that in the classroom. But we also would have done that, and we'll give you recommendations based specifically for that processing disorder.
Okay, any questions before I kind of get the last 10 minutes in with this learning disability profile?
Let's take a look at Thomas's profile. Thomas was referred because he doesn't seem to do well in any of the academic subject areas, but he seems a little bit better in math, the teacher's saying. He does really great in gym, and he's extremely popular. He's sometimes starting to act out in class, so he makes people laugh. He really seems to like that. It is disturbing to the teacher. When the teacher goes over step by step with him, he seems to understand, and the teacher just really wants to know what his profile is so she can know how best to serve him. Let's look at first his intelligence. Does he have average intellectual ability? Well, we see it all falls, all the higher order thinking and reasoning skills fall within the average range. So that's a hard yes. Is his academic progress moving forward the way we would want? Well, someone with average intellect, you'd expect to have average academics, and we see a lot, he has some. So he has this sentence combining that is average, and he has his math reasoning that's average, so that's great. But Thomas is not succeeding well in reading for the most part, and spelling and sentence building. So we can talk about the difference of that if we do have time. And he's also not fluent in his math calculations. So if you give him a chance to think about it with unlimited time, that's great. But if you're asking him to just quickly complete additions, that's harder for him. So, are his academics progressing as expected? No. Is there an area of deficit that can logically explain this discrepancy? That's the question that's different in LD compared to MID and DD. So I'm going to actually move this block over. Here you have the academics, and I've separated out areas of processing weakness and other areas of processing strength. So you see that there are a lot of other things that he does well. I can't read that because it's too little. Usually you lean in. So his visual memory and his visual working memory and his phonological awareness actually are really good. And so that's odd because usually phonological awareness predicts reading difficulty or reading success, and he doesn't. So we know there's something else going on here. And for him, it's his cognitive efficiency. So his working memory, when information comes in. So if I ask him, for example, to repeat numbers or to repeat them backwards or reorganize them, or worse, reorganize letters and numbers, kind of separate them out, that's really hard for him. And he's also very slow at copying information and slow at pulling information from his mind. So that's what these 3 weaknesses are. So are there areas of deficit that logically explain the discrepancy with the academics? And that's also a yes. So in summary, he's a 13-year-old boy in grade 8. He's been struggling academically since grade 2, which I'm saying now for the first time. He's better at math than in reading and writing, but he has a very solid and average IQ. His academics are lower than expected, and he has weaknesses in cognitive efficiency and rapid naming that are logically related to his academic weaknesses. So Thomas meets criteria for diagnosis of a learning disability, and his behavior in the class is likely a byproduct of his unaccommodated LD. I didn't show you, but his attention scores were all average. So what this deficit predicts, not necessarily what's going on with Thomas, but this is what we should know. He should have difficulty with multi-step instructions. He will have failure to use strategies while studying, so we might need some support there. He'll have difficulty paraphrasing and summarizing information because he has a hard time kind of holding all that information in mind. If you look at math, again, the multi-step problems might be an issue, which is probably why his calculations are off. He has a weakness with keeping track of the different steps, and he'll have difficulty with mental math. In reading, he'll have difficulty remembering the sound word associations, and that will result in poor reading fluency. His reading comprehension might be reduced, and we saw his reading comprehension was a little higher than his decoding, I believe. But that's because just difficulty holding information in mind. The low fluency will be because of the rapid naming, and that will also impact comprehension. And there'll be problems with simultaneously remembering a comprehension question and integrating the information from the passage. So you'll want to make sure to leave a trace of that information. In writing, he'll have difficulty with writing, organizing his thoughts in writing, integrating the organization and the grammar, and difficulty with sequencing of ideas. So the programming for a child with this profile would be to identify as communication learning disability. So again, those are 2 things. So I'm providing a diagnosis of learning disability, and I'm recommending the category communication learning disability, which I always would if the diagnosis is present. Again, comes back to a team decision with regard to what the identification is. For him, I recommend, and this is not a lot of uptake on this, but I recommend alternative goals on improving basic decoding skills, and I recommend that in the resource room, because in the class, I want the child to be completely at grade level, even for reading, and so we're accommodating to make sure that he can either listen to all of the books or have the books read to him. So I wouldn't want the child to stop listening to grade appropriate material just because he can't decode. So that's the huge difference. Because if you do that with a child with DD, it's not going to help them that they're listening to the book. So some general classroom accommodations is like technology is way out there. So text to speech, audiobooks, speech to text, visual organizers. He's going to need extra time because of his processing speed deficit. Always teach a growth mindset, because if you didn't win this time, you might win next time, and it will get easier. And children with LD do succeed extremely well in life. You'll monitor self-monitoring, so teach them even some self-talk for comprehension. And we're down to the last 2 minutes, so I did provide you with these accommodations, and we are going to be talking about LD again. So what I'm going to do on Friday is go over different LD profiles and maybe some different accommodations with regard to that particular profile. Just the takeaway is there are a lot of processing deficits that can come and impact a child who is of average intelligence. Have a good day, everyone.